Hello, my name is Andy Salomon and I'm presenting a project about emotional capital practices that babies enact in early childhood education contexts. I would like to acknowledge the Jean Denton Memorial Scholarship for supporting and funding this project in part and the opportunities that it has afforded. In Australia, it is customary to acknowledge country and acknowledge the Indigenous people whose lands we are on. And so I'm at home today on the Gundungurra and Darug people's lands, and I would like to thank the elders past, present and emerging for sharing their lands. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Wiradjuri people whose land I am on when I'm working and during the project that I'm presenting today. So the project is about emotional capital practices, and what I've done is broken each part of that phrase down. Emotional capital is a form of symbolic capital. And so there are different kinds of capital, just like money is a form of capital that you accumulate over time. And what I could see in the research I had done and in my practice with very young children was that they were engaging in these purposeful behaviours as a form of currency, these emotionally evocative communications that from a very young age that they could take out and use from their bank of emotional understandings. And these are things that they had developed since birth. And so it grounded in this production of different kinds of power. And so it was very clear to see that, there was a connection to be made with emotional capital, which had been theorised in relation to the emotional labour of early childhood educators. But really in this article here is where I made the connection with the ways that infants draw on emotional capital as this repertoire of emotional skills. And when you think of practices, I'd like you first to think of the theory of practice architectures, which I used in this project. And practice theory more generally refers to practices as the actions, everyday actions and interactions that we engage with. But according to the theory of practice architectures, those individual practices are sayings, doings and relatings. And these practices are enabled and constrained. They're shaped by the arrangements of the social site of practice. So when a number of people come together, they're engaging in different practices, they create this social setting where practices that shape our practices. So for example, the arrangements of this presentation, the material economic arrangements. I'm sitting at a desk. I'm not at my standing desk, which is next to me. So just by walking into the room, these arrangements have shaped what I might do. I'm using Zoom. This is probably my, I don't know how many times attempt at, conducting this or recording this presentation. So I've been constrained by some of the arrangements. But the way I'm using the idea of practices is in relation to babies. And so knowing that babies don't have sayings in words, I consider them as embodied sayings. They do things and they relate in certain ways. So this project aimed to document and really pull apart these emotional capital practices, the ways that the babies purposefully, actively evoke emotion. And so with that notion of power in a very powerful way. And that's in relation to both positive emotion, which you can see in the middle here. These few pictures came out of my doctoral work, where a baby was overtly and over exaggerating a smile towards another child and then directed that same smile to me once she was done. What you see at the top reflects the fact that I've noticed these behaviours not just in my practice as an early childhood teacher, but also as a parent. So this is my child pretending to cry. And so he's really kind of doing these particular things, I guess, to engage. And the same at the bottom you can see, which is a picture that's come out of this project. So what I'm talking about today is this first aim, where I'm really looking to document and deconstruct these practices that babies use in their interactions in early childhood settings. And so the way I did it was to bring a very good camera into an early childhood setting and take notes with a notebook and take wonderful photos and videos. And then what I did is I brought this data to the educators who know the babies certainly better than I did. And so what we would do is look at some of the these things that the babies were doing and saying and how they were relating and deciding, are they sayings, doings and relating? So I would just say blinking, and they would say, so babies were pretending to blink, they were waving, they were cocking their head, they were pointing. So there were these things that, you know, by just looking at a room, you can see lots of activity happening, but by looking very closely, when you break it down, there are very particular practices that babies are engaging in. And what started to be very clear very early is that different babies were engaging with very particular practices. So they all kind of had their thing. Some babies would, you know, be very fierce in their emotional expression. Some were a bit more relaxed in their expression. Some babies would use their face in very particular ways. Others would be more cautious and look more carefully and not engage. And so these individual portraits of children became quite interesting. And my next step is to use 50 years of developmental literature to start to code some of these sayings, doings and relatings, because there's a lot that's already been written about how babies engage with their emotional and social communication. And so what you see here, I'll play you a few little clips, are a few examples. And one of the things that happened is that the babies wouldn't necessarily just do one thing or other. There was a combination of things. So here a baby is flapping her arms and looking and vocalizing.
I'm different IRC.
And doing it in a particular way. Here a baby wanted watermelon. She looks really closely, she screws up her face and vocalizes. She was following where that watermelon was going, and it was only by looking at the videos that we came to see that. And even the educator said, gosh, it's such a different perspective because when you're on the floor and when it's so busy, there's always a lot going on. And I won't show that one, but this one happens right at the beginning when he realizes I'm looking and I say hello, and it's a snapshot of a very big squidgy smile.
Do you have a good sleep?
And so you can see there's this, one of the things that I've already written about, but kept coming up, is this over-exaggeration of this smile. And so some of the literature that I've started looking at has pulled out some elements of analysis. So this Duchenne smile is called an enjoyment smile. And it's one that involves the muscles lifting in the corners of the mouth as a smile, and at the same time lifting cheeks and crinkling eyes at the corners. So you can see, you know, certainly I can see this connection with what the babies are doing, and they're doing this, but in an over-exaggerated way. I've come to see that there's a distinction between the social expression of emotion and its natural expression. So oftentimes when they are doing those over-exaggerated smiles, they're towards someone. Sometimes though, it's just a natural expression. And in this example, it's towards a door.
the other stuff that I've got to do and sign off.
Yeah.
Sarah to sign some off, and then he's got to sign some off as well.
Yeah, I've got stuff for
And then the other thing that's happening is this, these bursts of emotion, and they come through in these rhythms and the expression. And so these are just little snippets of these things that are coming up as themes, I guess, because it's still early in the analysis, in the formal analysis. But the intended outcomes of the project included a reciprocal research partnership. And I know this is a busy page, but what ended up happening was that in ways I became a part of the arrangements of the setting. So I took photos of the babies and I shared those, I laminated those, which you see here are babies eating, and then they put those photos up on the wall. So I shared the project with the families at the site. The babies and the educators started taking photos of me, and I am now a part of their Facebook group. So, you know, where it's not just that I've gone in to take information or data, and then, but it's also about giving back. And so that's something that's emerged as a really wonderful outcome to have achieved. The way that I am as a researcher is also something that's emerged, and there was a whole series of things that brought me to realise that it was okay to engage with the babies. It was written into my ethics, and it was only when they came to me, and they came to me often. As you can see here, they were interested in my things. They actually, you know, there was a point where they actually managed to get my camera. This one here, I'd look behind me and there's always someone there interested in what I was doing. And so I think that's a really interesting and useful contribution, certainly in terms of the way we research with babies. And this was a wonderful kind of outcome where, and it's starting to directly feed into the work that I do with pre-service teachers. Because a lot of the times people don't quite know what to do with babies, don't know how to play with babies. And so what I've documented is this game that emerged where I just pretended to sneeze. And I put a block on my head, and when I sneezed, the block fell down. Now what happened is that these babies, this was the first day that it happened, and they would bring me the block to try and do it again. The most special part is that a week later, when I came back, this little person actively kind of kept this game going. Oh, goodness.
She's not on the roll, but she normally comes in every Wednesday, like education. And on that phone, we have and woof woof there, woof there, woof everywhere, woof woof. Thank you. Oh my goodness, you've left the tube. You're playing that game. Ready?
And so it was so clear that this baby had purposely chosen to bring this card to me and was actively engaging me with this game that she remembered, I guess, in relation to me. But as it happens, the educator said she was playing it and another child was playing it for the whole week. So I won't have time to play this clip, but this is a clip of this child being really silly and this child just belly laughing. Now, one of the things that comes out of each of those points is that I think what's emerging is a view of infants as playful, as active, as social, and all these things that they're not given much credit for. So you see here that this baby's, you know, this toddler, because if they're doing it as babies, how good are they as toddlers? And so what's interesting to me is where this will go. I'm running out of time. I'm really excited to have shared it. If you'd like to be in touch, my email address is at the bottom. Thank you very much, and all the best.